Hello everybody and welcome to our first lesson for the America Making a Superpower module for A-level history. In this lesson we're going to take a very brief introduction to the time period that we're going to be beginning with, which is of course the era of Reconstruction immediately after the end of the US Civil War between around 1865 pushing into around the 1890s. And we're also going to talk about the Gilded Age, of course, which is what also takes place during this period, and we'll examine the framework, the precedents, and some of the issues that had plagued the state at this point. So, like I said, this is the first lesson for the USA Making a Superpower module. We're going to be taking our understanding of history from this lesson here in 1865 all the way to the 1980s with the election of Ronald Reagan, and we'll talk about the process by which the United States grows into the superpower that it still is to this day. This lesson we're going to look at the consequences of the American Civil War as well as the era of Reconstruction, which takes place immediately after the American Civil War. It's important to talk about the events leading up to the era of Reconstruction as well as to examine the structure of the US government. Of course, these are things that are very important to have at least a superficial understanding of at the beginning of this series, because otherwise it informs some of the important elements that you need to understand when we think about how the history develops over time. So the American Civil War, which began under the pretense of the state's rights to own slaves, the state's rights to allow people to own slaves. It was fought entirely because of slavery. Don't let anybody question or disagree with that particular point. Ended in 1865 in April. It was with the surrender of the Confederacy, the Southern forces, who broke away from the United States of America and formed their own confederacy, and the Confederate forces ultimately would surrender. The Civil War was the most costly in terms of lives of any conflict that the United States has ever been involved in. It was around 625,000 people who had died, and around $6 billion in terms of revenue that was lost, or in terms of money that was lost as a result. So, the Republican president during the Civil War was Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln was the individual who, upon his election, caused a lot of the stirring up of the Civil War in the first place, given the fact that many in the South believed that with the election of a Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, this would lead to the eventual abolition of slavery, which they were correct about, but they anticipated that this would be the case, and this was one of the reasons why states began to secede from the Union. So the president of this during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, was assassinated by an individual by the name of John Wilkes Booth at a theater, and essentially his successor would be the Democratic president Andrew Johnson. Now, I want to make it very clear at the beginning here about the political parties that we are talking about at this point. So you might, if you understand anything about American politics to this day, have an understanding of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party as being completely different to the ways in which the parties had been understood at this point in the Civil War. So, for example, the Republican Party today is the party of Bush, of Trump, of Reagan, of all of these what would be considered conservative, right-wing, in some cases far right-wing individuals. And that the Democratic Party to this day is, of course, the Clintons, Obama, Joe Biden, the current president. Now, this is because at some point in the 1950s and the 1960s, we actually see a flipping of the ideologies of the two political parties. So the Republican president in this during the Civil War was Abraham Lincoln, who had supported for the only for the purposes of maintaining unity, of course, the abolition of slavery. But when we see as time goes on, we will see that the Republican Party becomes ever more conservative and the Democratic Party becomes ever more liberal, owing to some of the election strategies that takes place in the 1950s and the 1960s. Becomes known as the Southern Strategy. So the parties flipped is essentially the short answer to this question. And so as a result of this, the Democratic president, Andrew Johnson, would replace the Republican president, Abraham Lincoln. Now, I want to make it very clear that at the beginning of this lesson, we need to have a basic understanding of how the structure of the US government and the structure of the US system of politics actually works, just very briefly, okay? We're not government and politics students here. But what we have in the United States is something known as a codified constitution. The Constitution of the US is a single written document that you can hold in your hand, or you can find online as a PDF document, and it has all the articles, it has all of the amendments, etc., etc. It is a single outline document. Now, what this document does, the Constitution, in the first 3 articles of the Constitution, outlines the roles and powers of what are known as branches of government. Now, branches of government are essentially different parts of the broader government structure that do different things, that have different roles. So, for example, you have the US government being made up of an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. Judicial branch is very easy. It's the court system, the federal court, represented at the highest level with the US Supreme Court. The executive branch is represented by the president, the White House, the broader executive functions that exist there. And then we have the legislature, which is Congress. Now, Congress is very similar to how Parliament acts in the United Kingdom, structured in different ways, continues to have 2 chambers like we do in the United Kingdom, but they do different things and they have different outlining powers. Now, the idea here is that each of these different branches have different powers, and that these different powers all balance each other out. So, for example, Congress, the legislature, is responsible for the making and passing of law, of legislation. And so that's essentially what the power of Congress is. The executive branch, the president, is responsible for the implementation of law and policy, and that's all that they do. And then the judiciary is responsible for the interpretation and application of the law, and also to ensure that the law is in line with the codified constitution. If it goes against the constitution, then the Supreme Court can say, this is unconstitutional, you can't have this law. So those are the 3 different functions of each of these branches of government, and they all balance each other out. So we have what are known as checks and balances, and these are all found in the Constitution or have been established by judicial precedent. So, for example, the way in which law is passed is it goes through the houses of Congress, and then it goes to the desk of the president, who then ratifies that piece of legislation. Now, if the president decides, actually, this isn't actually very good, I don't want to ratify this piece of legislation, the president can enact something known as a veto. It can veto that legislation. That is considered to be a check on the power of Congress. So essentially, if Congress gets a bit too big for its boots and starts passing potentially unconstitutional or potentially broad and overarching powerful pieces of legislation that the president doesn't like, the president can check that and say, actually, no, you're not going to do that. I'm going to veto this legislation. And then on the other hand, if the president is seen as being actually overly powerful and overly big for his boots, with the veto power that he has, then the legislature in Congress can say, well, we don't want to respect this veto. We're going to vote in a 2/3 majority to override your veto. And that is considered to be a check on the president's power by Congress. This is how these things work. They all have different checks and balances that all exist. And if you're somebody who studies A-level politics and is going to study it into their second year, you will get to a point where you look at checks and balances in the US. You'll basically draw a big triangle with each corner being each branch of government, and you'll draw lines that show all the different checks and balances across each of the different institutions. That's essentially how it works. So that's the crash course US government and politics done in about 3 minutes. Okay, let's get back to the history. Johnson and the form of Reconstruction. Following the end of the Civil War, we have a period that is known as Reconstruction. The aim of this period is, of course, to assimilate the southern states back into the broader Union and to ensure that essentially we can get a unified state back following what was the bloodiest conflict in US history. Now, Reconstruction involved two main issues. The question was, how far should we punish the southern states for even seceding from the Union in the first place? That's an interesting question. Some people wanted retribution for the costs of the succession of the southern states. Some people didn't believe that that would be potentially amicable or apt or even fair to do. The second question is how African Americans, who were mainly former slaves, should be treated in the southern states. Don't forget, slavery was a massive deal for the southern states, specifically the southern states. Slavery contributed the majority of the southern states' economy, to the southern states' economy. It was so important and powerful of an institution that the southern states went to civil war and seceded from the Union in order to keep slavery. The secession document of I forget which state it is. I believe it may. I'm not sure on which state it was. Made it very, very clear that the reason why, in their first line of secession, the reason why we are essentially seceding is because we want to protect this one simple truth. And this is the idea that the African American is subordinate to the white man, is essentially what they say in not so many words. So slavery was the main driving factor for the Civil War even taking place. And so within the southern states, we have now a number of formerly slaves who have now been freed. They were freed as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation, which essentially was enacted by Johnson to free only the southern states' slaves. That's one point that you should know. Now, this wasn't formally codified until we get to the 13th Amendment, which we'll get to in a second. So what do we have at this point? We have a number of individuals who are now free, formerly African American slaves, who at this point are still deeply, deeply, deeply unpopular. The majority of the southern states don't believe that these people are even human, let alone should have any kind of rights to the same level as quote unquote the white American. Johnson did not want to punish the South for the secession of the into the Confederacy. One of the main reasons for this, of course, is because it would be seen as essentially continuing the punishment for seceding in the first place. Given the fact that they had already lost the war, I believe it would probably have been the case that Johnson wanted to just move on from this whole sorry affair. And so they did not want to punish the South. And then when it comes to the question of African Americans, he believed that it was up to, and it should be the responsibility of each individual state to understand how it treats its African American population. This is a problematic issue. Most members of Congress were opposed to this view, since they were mostly Republicans. Many were even radical Republicans who wished to see harsh punishment taken against the southern states. So they were very radical in their political positions against the southern states for the Civil War in the first place, and also the treatment of African Americans. Now, when we think about what happens at this point, we have to think about the fact that Johnson is a Democratic president, and the majority of Congress is Republican. Now, and a lot of these Republicans were radical Republicans as a result of the Civil War, and had very, very important ideological positions in relation and also in opposition to what Johnson believed. Congress rejected Johnson's plans and instead decided to pass its own law, its own legislation. This legislation becomes known as the Civil Rights Act. Now, as per one of the checks and balances that we've looked at earlier on, Johnson decided to veto this legislation. However, in April of 1866, Congress overrode this veto and voted to override it, and so it became law. It was passed into law. This is a good example of why I use the veto and the overriding of the veto as an example of the checks and balances in an earlier slide. In fact, I didn't even realize that this was part of this. I forgot that this was even part of the slide, so I'm glad I used that as an example and I didn't use a different check and balance instead, because it ties this whole lesson together really nicely now. So Congress voted to override the veto in April of 1866, and so therefore the Civil Rights Act gets passed. The Civil Rights Act would later become part of the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution, and essentially It would allow all African Americans born in the United States citizenship and full rights in law. So not only would this become legislation that is passed by Congress but is subordinate to the Constitution, instead it becomes part of the Constitution itself and is codified into law. In November of 1866, Republicans gained a huge majority in both houses of Congress. The two houses of Congress are the House of Representatives and the Senate. The Republicans gained a huge majority in both of these, and it gave them the power to, as per their constitutional authority, to impeach Johnson. Now, what impeachment essentially involves is the president acting in a way that is beyond their authority or maybe unlawfully in a number of different settings. And so Congress has the power to vote to impeach them. You can vote to impeach, which is done by the House of Representatives, and then the trial for impeachment is done by the Senate. And if they vote that the impeachment was proper, and they vote that the impeachment was accurate and correct, it therefore means that that individual, that president or potentially Supreme Court justice, gets removed from office. Now, the impeachment trial has happened quite a few times in U.S. history. Happens here with Johnson. It nearly happened with President Nixon over the Watergate scandal, but he resigned before impeachment could take place. It happened with President Bill Clinton with the Monica Lewinsky scandal and the committing perjury. The I did not have sexual relations with that woman, quote unquote. And then it happened twice under the Trump administration. One for the quid pro quo in relation to giving Russian weapons. Giving weapons to Ukraine. I apologize. In response for essentially political dirt on the Biden administration or the Biden campaign. The second impeachment that Trump had to endure was in relation to his incitement of the January 6th congressional riots, where a number of his supporters went and broke in, and a number of people died, in fact. This takes place in 2021, I believe, in January 2021. So the power of impeachment is something that is very powerful for a congressional authority, especially when they win a huge majority and when the Democrats and the Republicans do not share the same institutions of government. When you've got a Democrat in the presidency and then you've got a Republican in Congress. Now, he would survive the impeachment, but only by a single vote. And so in 1868, his presidential term would end, and this would lead to the victory of the Republican president and former Union General Ulysses S. Grant. Now, Ulysses S. Grant really gives us to a point where we are starting to move away from the era of Reconstruction and actually into the period known as the Gilded Age, which we'll get to in a few lessons' time. Congress passed 4 separate Reconstruction Acts which placed southern states under military rule during this period. This becomes known as a period of radical Reconstruction, and it is viewed by most historians as something of a failure. African Americans were voted into political office, but because of the fact that they were former slaves, they were poorly educated and therefore lacked any kind of experience to even deal with the issues of political office. It was a very, very controversial thing to be a slave and to be educated, to be able to read, for example. That was seen as very, very bad if you were one. And so as a result of this, most were very poorly educated, most couldn't read, most were illiterate, and the result of this is that they were voted into political office but didn't lack the experience to deal with those problems. We have the entry of what are known as carpetbaggers and scalawags into political and economic spheres. This was also a deeply unpopular issue when it comes to the respect and the response, should I say, that was had by Southern whites in that regard. Many white people embarked on a policy of terror to intimidate African Americans into withdrawing from the political process. So don't forget, the Southern whites, there are Southern whites who are still deeply, deeply racist and still believe that slavery was a good thing to this day. So imagine the Southern whites that existed immediately after the Civil War, the humiliation of the loss of the Civil War, and now having to endure not only African Americans having rights and are no longer slaves, but now also allowing them to hold political office. This obviously was very, very, very unpopular among Southern whites, and so many white people did embark on this terror and intimidation tactics. African Americans ensuring that against African Americans, ensuring that they withdraw from the political process. Most notable was the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, which was formed in 1866. We will come back to the Ku Klux Klan at multiple points during this period. We will see them have a bit of a resurgence at the end of the Civil War. They will sort of fade away into obscurity, and then they will be back again as we get into the 20th century, and we get to things like the issue of civil rights and segregation. Another a white group, should I say, called the Redeemers, were also formed, and they would attack corruption within government. By the 1870s, many in the North were tired of this idea of radical reconstruction. It was seen as something of a long and arduous process that was taking place. The result of the 1876 presidential election was therefore a contested one. The Compromise of 1877 led to Southern Democrats supporting the Republican candidate, who was Rutherford Hayes, if Reconstruction was promised to come to an end. So a compromise was had, an ultimatum was given. The Southern Democrats said that they would support the appointment of a Republican president only if Reconstruction were to end, and this becomes known as the Compromise of 1877. Rutherford Hayes becomes elected president, and as a result of this, Reconstruction ends, and we move into the next major period, which is known as the period of the Gilded Age.